Well, we're now going to get to the inevitable season and episode reviews of Game of Thrones, and I'm going to start off being not spoilers to be open to new people. So apologies if it's a little coy how I'm describing the basic contours of the plot and characters. So overall, this is going to be a fairly positive review because it's a very, very strong season. The bad news is, of course, that it's only going to be limited for a few more seasons, and then there's going to be a sharp decline in quality. And that's the paradox of, like, why is the first couple of seasons actually some of the strongest seasons, and as we get further and further along, the story gets worse and worse? And I guess I can only say that George gave them a very good roadmap, and they followed it, and so the execution can be faulted in certain places. For instance, there's a lot of minor characters they introduce in the first season, and they stay around for a little bit, but then, bizarrely, they just go away or killed off or just disappear. They just don't seem to exist anymore. And that's a little disappointing. So in that respect, the books are going to be a lot better with the minor characters. If, however, you're really just into the major characters, and I'm really not into the major characters, then I think the first season is going to be a pretty good selection of the book. They do a good job of trimming a lot of the fat. I mean, a lot of the power of the style of the books comes from the sheer excess that George tries to write the books with. I'm not a big fan of the excessive stuff. I prefer him when he's a little bit more lean, like Fever Dream or some of the shorter stories, but some people really, really like the, basically fat Martin, to put it nicely. And so you're going to miss a lot of the rich descriptions that he's going to give to the various places, the locales, the food, and things like that. So you're not going to get as detailed sex scenes or violent scenes or scenes about, the customs that make up the various peoples. And if you look closely and try to hear some of the characters, it is going to be a little weird because the accents don't really match up at all. They make sense in terms of the British cast. They do have a lot of Americans, but it's mainly a British cast. But it doesn't make sense in terms of the story world, like how so many different accents are sort of just dispersed geographically. So that's kind of annoying if you notice those things. There are also some major, major plot holes with Cersei, Caitlyn, and a couple of the other characters, which the books aren't a little bit better. Those plot holes still exist. Probably the biggest one that's going to be the most obvious in terms of the plot is the dagger. That really, really doesn't make sense how it plays out with Tyrion and some of the other characters, because as George tells us, Valyrian steel is very, very rare. So the question would be, well, how did such a rare dagger just show up out of nowhere? And if it is so rare, how would it, go missing and nobody would notice it? So that's a pretty big one. And the wall has always been a major problem too, that its sizes and dimensions aren't really consistent in the books. And it's not much better in the first season. But again, if you don't really want to nitpick through the plot too much, I think the basic contours are pretty strong in terms of the characters, especially Ned. I mean, I think Ned structures the whole season very, very well. So an added reason why the first season is so well done is that they do get a lot of the older actors and the more experienced actors, and they really anchor the film in terms of Robert, Ned, Littlefinger, Varys, and some of the key players. And I think they just made a very strategic mistake to lean on the more younger actors much later as the seasons progress, which some of it makes sense because they're killed off, right? I mean, some major characters are going to get killed off the first season, so you can't use them later on, but it did seem that they should have been more tasteful in keeping people and retaining people, and they ended up getting rid of, I think, some of the best actors, and so the quality is going to decline markedly. But overall, in terms of the costumes, special effects, locations, casting, again, we have to remember the first season, they really didn't have that much money. So given the limitations of the budget, obviously the books are going to be a lot better and going into details into the battles and, the sizes of the castles and things like that. And the show was never going to be able to match that. But if you're being more generous, and I think you should be with television production, especially even HBO, I mean, you might think it has all the money in the world, but they do have limits. So given the constraints and given how very few fantasy shows actually are out there, much less this size and scope and this many characters, I mean, just coordinating this many people was pretty remarkable. So again, given the limitations they had, this is a pretty good season and it's going to get a very, very high mark. My own personal dislikes and likes are not that great. Probably the only two major ones are Tyrion and the Arya problem. With Arya, there's a really big death scene. I'm not going to indicate the character, but it is much, much, much better done in the books. It's much more impactful, and the way she gets to know this person is very powerful. And the show really drops the ball on that, and that's a very critical relationship. It really defines her character. So they did a very poor job on that, and you're going to notice very early on how much Tyrion is favored. The books, again, are not much better. You kind of know how much George likes Tyrion. And Tyrion does suffer. I want to be very clear. He's not safe. But we know for a fact he's going to stay alive. Not just in the first season or the first book. He's going to be around for a while. And I think George could have done a little bit more to make it more tension-filled, because any difficulty that Tyrion comes up against, he invariably is going to find some clever way out of it. So that's a little disappointing that there's not going to be a lot of tension with Tyrion. Again, if you're paying attention, you're going to know right away, okay, despite the difficulties, he's gonna be around for a while. With the other characters, though, I think it is very well done in terms of who leaves, who stays, and why things happen. In terms of minor dislikes, I think the conspiracy with Cersei is much better rendered in the books. Here in the show, it's just very sudden. It just happens, and the way things line up with Cersei and her side is a little too miraculous, so that's a little annoying in terms of the plot line. But overall, very well done, very well recommended, but given the politics of HBO and D&D, I can't recommend buying or paying for it. So if you can just find a way to see it through a friend or some other means, I think that's probably the best bet. But again, I would say that it's a shame because there is a lot of good stuff here, but given the way HBO does do its marketing, it probably doesn't really finely tune itself, so it would just assimilate the sales into all the other sales. So I do recommend highly seeing it. It's very well done, very well written, very well acted. So aside from some minor problems with the plot and pacing, it's a fairly well done season, again, because it sticks very closely to the books and does, I think, a very good job of shortening places where it really wasn't necessary for George to go on for too long. So I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. Very highly recommended. Very well done. Okay, this has been a non-spoiler review of Game of Thrones Season 1, GRRM Thrones Analyzed. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.